I want to talk about Nahom. It's one of those names which occurs in no other text and is sort of plopped into the story of Lehi and Sariah and their traveling party, almost with a dare, find this place. Well, it has been found. And in fact, its discovery has been called the first archaeological proof of the Book of Mormon. Let me talk a bit about how this came about. My wife and I were subscribers to a magazine called Aramco World. And this magazine would arrive with wonderful stories about the Middle East, both ancient and modern. And on one occasion in late 1997, I was reading an article on an exhibit that was showing in Paris at the time. This exhibit included ancient Yemen artifacts. And in one of the photographs that was featured in the article, I could see a votive altar. What drew my attention was the architecture in miniature. There are tiny steps, there are inset windows, there are stalactite formations decorating the bottom of the roof, and so on. The reason that I was interested in that is because in Lehi's dream, he calls the building that he saw, the great and spacious building, strange. Now, it's not the only thing he calls strange in his dream. He also called certain paths and roads strange. And it occurred to me that he thought the building strange, at least partly because of its architecture. He came from a place, Jerusalem, which had architectural influences both from Babylon to the east and from Egypt to the southwest. And there would have been circles, like in building materials, like pillars and so on. But everything in South Arabia is square. Everything comes to a right angle. And so I thought perhaps Lehi saw strange architecture. So I wrote to Paris, to the exhibit giver, the exhibit host, and ordered a catalog. And this book arrived in the mail on ancient Yemen. That was the exhibit. Its first showing was in Paris. Then it was to go on to Madrid, eventually end up in London, and even be shown in Washington, D.C. When the catalog arrived, I, of course, was interested in the pieces that showed architectural features. So I found a series of altars. They're called votive altars because they were carved by a donor. He had them carved, and then he would give this altar to a temple. So I had my camera right down next to the page with macro lens on it, and I was taking photographs of different altars, and I thought I should read what the excavator says. The excavator was Burkhard Vogt, a German archaeologist. So I read this thing. This is the limestone altar from the 7th and 6th centuries BC. And around the top, there was an inscription band where the donor wrote his name, his father's name, grandfather's name, and tribal name, and the occasion on which he gave the altar to the temple. Well, the temple stands just outside the ancient capital and still modern city of Marib, of the Sabaean kingdom, ancient Sabaean kingdom. It was capital of that kingdom. So I begin to read, Beathar, son of Sawad, son of Nawan, the Nehmite, on the occasion gave the altar and a person to the temple. So obviously this donor has given a person to the temple to be a permanent fixture, permanent servant, a permanent helper. Kind of like Samuel's mother Hannah did for him when he was just young. Well, I'm a little slow. It took a while, but about 30 minutes later, it dawned on me that I had just read the word Nahom as a tribal name. In ancient Semitic languages, you deal with language not written with vowels, but only with consonants. So the name Nahom in 1 Nephi, chapter 16, the place of Ishmael's death and burial, was written in the text NHM. I know it's spelled in English Nahom, but that's the modern rendition of this that Joseph Smith dictated. But at base, it's NHM. And I just read those same letters as the name of a tribe, which it turns out gave its name to a certain geographical area in South Arabia. Well, I thought, so here's an altar carved in sometime in the 7th-6th centuries BC, exactly when Lehi and Sariah were on the road, and it preserves a name from South Arabia in the approximate place that we would expect it. So I started to write. I wrote a short article. I sent it over to the editor of the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies. This issue, which is number 8, issue 8, number 1. So I sent it over to John Sorensen, who was then the editor. I'd included words like maybe, perhaps, possibly, those kinds of words, not being really too pushy about reaching any conclusion. He sent it back almost immediately and said, get rid of all those words. Let's be more definite. So in this issue of the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies, in the back, sandwiched between an article on the so-called Lehi Cave in South Israel, southern Israel, and an article on the nth and transcript, sat my little piece, the place which was called Nahom, New Light from Arabia. So that's where it began. It was published, and those who read the article and knew the issue sensed immediately that in the name of the tribe, we now had confirmation of the name that Nephi parks in his narrative. That felt pretty good, I must say. But there's a second story associated with this. It took a while, but people who don't like the Book of Mormon, who think it's a fraud, and so on, finally got around to mounting another explanation. Well, it couldn't possibly be that Joseph Smith knew this name through inspiration. There had to be another way to explain his inserting this name into his narrative. A colleague, Dan Peterson, drew my attention to a blog post where someone had theorized that Joseph Smith had gone to the Dartmouth College library and found it in one of two publications. This person theorized that when the Smith family was living in Lebanon, New Hampshire, and Hiram, Joseph's older brother, was a student at an academy there, that young Joseph, now 6 or 7, wanders over to the Dartmouth College library. And this also is another assumption, that he was interested in pre-Islamic Arabian geography. And another assumption, he pulled a couple of books off the shelf, went browsing through them, found on maps inside the books the name Nahom, Nehhm, for a certain spot in ancient Arabia. Then 15 years later, when he's dictating the Book of Mormon to Oliver Cowdery, he remembers this name and sticks it into the narrative as a place name. The assumption also is that Joseph Smith can actually go from where his family is living to Dartmouth College, which is a good piece away, several miles away, and that the injury or the weakness of his leg, for which he suffered a surgical procedure with no anesthesia, that he somehow, either before or after the surgery, made it over to the college library. All these assumptions. And the reason was that the needed books are currently in Dartmouth's collection. So they must have been available to Joseph Smith. So I read this thing and I thought, has anybody looked at the accession records in the library? Accession records are records that are made for books that are received by a library that show the date of receipt in the library and sort of is the tracker for what happens to them. So I contacted the woman who is the institute teacher at Dartmouth. She had been in the past an employee of the university, so she knew her way around. I asked her, would you check on these two particular books? Books I had in mind were written, one by Karsten Niebuhr, a German who had gone to Yemen in the 18th century under the sponsorship of the Danish king. Spent a long time in Yemen, wrote a couple of books, including maps, and they're published in German, eventually translated into English before Joseph Smith was born, and were available in the United States, certainly by the time Joseph Smith was a child. The second one was written by a Frenchman in the middle of the 18th century, who also in a map of Arabia that he drew and inserted into his book, showed the same place, Nahom, in Arabia, southern Arabia. And that book had also been translated into English well before Joseph Smith's birth and was available in the United States. Well, this woman did her due diligence, found out that the German book, now translated into English, had been acquired by the library 25 years after the Smiths had left New Hampshire. The book, written by the Frenchman, a copy of it, was in the Dartmouth Library when the Smiths were living in New Hampshire, but that copy did not possess the map. Instead, several decades later, Dartmouth Library acquired the translation of the French book with the map. But the Smiths are long gone. And in fact, it was close to the time of Joseph Smith's death. So there's no way that Joseph could have consulted these volumes, found a name on a map, remembered it, and inserted it into his text of the Book of Mormon, chapter 16 of 1 Nephi, verse 34, 15 years later. As a test case, a couple of years later, I was at a conference in Providence, Rhode Island, at Brown University, which is one of my alma maters. So I went to the Special Collections building, the John Hay Library on the Brown campus, and I also consulted the accession records there. Both books, German book translated into English, French book translated into English, both of those were in the collection. But like at Dartmouth, those books did not come into the possession of the Brown Library until decades after they were published, and certainly decades after the Smith family had already gone to the West, Kirtland, Missouri, Nauvoo, even all the way to Utah, those who had survived. So the sense that Joseph Smith picked up this name from some place where he could consult it is simply beyond belief. It's already well over a century since Joseph Smith wrote those names in his text. Well, what does all this say? A student assistant once we had received notice from the institute instructor at Dartmouth that she had consulted the accession records and that these books were not received until decades after the Smiths were gone from that part of New England. My student assistant said, well, we can believe in the Book of Mormon again. Yes, but more than that, we already know that the Book of Mormon holds the Word of God, and that's my witness.